Frank asked me to talk a little bit about intelligence challenges in the years to come, and a bit also about what I spend most of my time on, which is working on oil dependence and how we can get off of it. Let me just say a few words about each. Back in the Cold War, I would say by the early 60s, a few years after Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech laying out all of Stalin's crimes, there were probably more true-believing revolutionary Marxist-Leninists in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan than there were in the Kremlin. I negotiated with those guys 4 times, and none of them wanted to die for the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They wanted to remodel their dachas. And they were an ideal enemy, actually, kind of, for the United States, because their ideology was dead, they were stodgy, they were thugs, many of them. They had a lousy economic system, and by doing what Kennan and Nitze said, containing, deterring, forming our alliances, we outlasted them. It took us 45 years, but their lousy system collapsed. And in an odd kind of way, I sort of miss them. Because they were sort of an ideal opponent for us, and we got used to dealing with them, and today still sometimes model our conduct on what would have worked with the Soviets. Whereas if you look at a situation such as, I feel like Henny Youngman, take the Middle East, please. If you look at a situation such as exists in the Middle East today, with Iran resembling in, I'm afraid, far too many ways, a subject I've written on, Germany in the 1930s, one is faced with dealing with a group of leaders, some at odds with one another, but nonetheless with which a somewhat critical mass of them are, not to be too politically incorrect, theocratic, totalitarian, genocidal maniacs. We know that deterrence, mutual assured destruction even, it was mutual not because we wanted it that way, but because the Soviets had nuclear weapons, but mutual assured destruction worked to deter war during the 45 years of the Cold War. But as Bernard Lewis says, mutual assured destruction with the Soviets was a deterrent. With many of the leaders of Iran today, it is unfortunately an inducement. Ahmadinejad goes down to Qum and talks to the Mahdi, who disappeared down a well in, I believe, the 9th century. I don't know if the Mahdi answers him or not, but he talks to him. He's built a highway for the Mahdi to come along from Qum when he comes back and returns to lead the battles that will end the world, for the Mahdi to come to Tehran. We have to understand how this type of thinking and these types of motivations can affect people and can affect fundamental policies, such as deterrence. We are not doing a good job of that. If anything, we are headed the opposite way in the rather strong pressure for political correctness and for us not even to talk about what the overall issue is. I mean, let's be blunt. Virtually all of the world's great religions have spawned off crazies from time to time. With us Protestants, I think particularly of the Peasants' Rebellion during Luther's time. Munzer controlled a fair section of Germany. He was, for all practical purposes, a Protestant Taliban. Certainly the Inquisition in Spain that our Catholic friends of that time were responsible for was not a bright spot in the history of Christianity. Certainly the Sicarii in first century Jerusalem, assassins, terrible assassins, are not a bright spot in the history of Judaism. The kamikazes are not a bright spot in the history of Shintoism. Many religions have in one way or another in their history come up with totalitarian movements, some relatively brief and small, some large. we are not good at dealing with this kind of motivation. We are a First Amendment country. We are a country peopled by the descendants largely of two sorts of folks. One is religious dissenters, and the other is people who are in debtors' prisons. So that's one of the reasons the bankruptcy structure is in the Constitution. We are, as far as the First Amendment goes, in a situation where we feel as if we may well be striking at the roots of what is precious to all of us, namely religious freedom and freedom of speech, if we get into even discussions about how a religion might be influencing a policy of totalitarianism. If you showed up in my neighborhood or most any neighborhood in the United States as a new resident and the people had a barbecue for you and you're standing around talking and somebody says, asks you, where do you go to church? And you say, well, I'm a Branch Davidian. The other folks there are not likely to say, well, why did you kill all those people in Waco a few years ago? They're far more likely to say, oh, really? Well, I'm a Methodist myself, have a beer. We don't like getting into people's religious beliefs. This country's history with respect to anti-Semitism and anti-Catholic feeling and so forth is far from perfect, but it's a lot better than most countries. And we have a terrible time getting into and understanding something which may well have religious roots. It does not help for people to be steered away from even talking about this issue. I have a friend from another country who's a real expert on the Middle East and was invited to a conference a couple of months ago to speak at the Pentagon. And a two-star officer said to him beforehand, look, I'm afraid I have to tell you something. He said, the title of your speech and anything up within the first few minutes of it shouldn't refer to religion in any way. I know you're talking about terrorism, and I know from your writings that you think there may be some links here, but please don't say anything about that. Until you get down further in the speech, so it's not up front or anything, you could allude to it, but please bear with us on this. This is a policy that's been determined. You can't deal with something if you can't talk about it. And our first objective, long before we get into the techniques of espionage and how you penetrate totalitarian groups of this sort as contrasted to the communist parties of the 1960s and 70s, all of that side of intelligence has to start with being able clearly and honestly, as Steve Coughlin and others do, talk about the problem. Second issue, where does all their money come from? United States borrows about $1 billion a day to import oil. That's $350 to $400 billion a year. That goes into the pockets of those abroad who produce oil. And it is all orchestrated by what in American civil law would be called a conspiracy and restraint of trade, namely a cartel, namely OPEC. OPEC controls about 78% of the world's reserves of conventional petroleum. And oil dominates 95, 96% of the world's transportation. So we have a total monopoly, essentially, oil over transportation, and something very close to a monopoly, at least a strong oligopoly, of OPEC over oil. It costs a few dollars a barrel to lift oil in Saudi Arabia. It costs many tens of dollars a barrel to lift it in the United States or Canada. So if we drill, whether we do the sands and tar sands in Canada and pipelines, or whether we drill in the Gulf, or whether we drill in Alaska, what that is relevant to is improving our balance of payments. It does that. It doesn't do anything else. It does not break OPEC. It does not make us energy independent. Britain had all the oil it needed from the North Sea. It was energy independent in 2008. When the price of oil went through the roof, it went through the roof in Britain too. And their truckers went on a great strike because diesel was so expensive. You can't insulate yourself from the world market unless you trash it, unless the situation is so dire that you're not going to have international trade in oil anymore. At that point, you seal yourself off and get by on half of what you normally get by on, or a little bit more if you drill a little bit. But are you becoming energy independent by drilling for oil at tens of dollars a barrel cost in the United States when the Saudis and the Iranians can adjust the price as they see fit? No. It's a fantasy. And we have to, if we are going to deal with the fact that we borrow $1 billion a day to import oil, and that oil, that money, goes very heavily to OPEC. Now, OPEC only, even though it's got 78% of the world's oil, it only sells each year about 35–40% of the world's oil. That's because it's withholding oil from the market to keep the price up. So that world is the world we live in, and we will not change it. We will not change the huge amount of money going to indirectly to support terrorist groups, going to, as Lawrence Wright says in The Looming Tower, support 90% of the world's Islamic institutions through Saudi Arabia. That will not change until and unless we get off oil. And most of the bright ideas about doing that require major changes in infrastructure. I love T. Boone Pickens. He's a great guy. The natural gas for trucks and delivery vehicles and stuff makes a lot of sense. But for the family car, you've got to put in natural gas pumps at every filling station. You've got to redo the natural gas infrastructure. That's why major studies recently, MIT and otherwise, say if you want to take advantage of hydrofracturing and the cheap natural gas and plentiful natural gas, and you want to take advantage of it for transportation, turn it into methanol. Not ethanol, methanol, wood alcohol. We have it all over the place. It's just not in large volumes. Your windshield wiper fluid's methanol. We could do this. You can have a very simple change in the software of Chevy Suburbans or any other car of that size that lets you do what the Brazilians do. As you pull into the filling station, you can look up and say, oh, I can buy gasoline for this today, or I can buy ethanol for this, or I can buy methanol from natural gas for this. The methanol looks cheaper. I think I'll fill up with that. That's called a free market. That's called breaking a cartel. That's not called a mandate. That's called breaking a cartel. If you want to see real unhappiness on the part of the mullahs in Tehran, on the part of Mr. Putin, on the part of some of our friends in Latin America, such as in Venezuela, if you want to see real unhappiness on the part of those folks and make a lot else easier for us, try introducing real competition into the fuel market. I mean, we figured out how to deal with the communists. We tried to make communism illegal. Congress passed the Smith Act. The Supreme Court struck it down. So they went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a bunch of restrictions that didn't make being a communist illegal. You could still stand on the street corner and preach communism, and Gus Hall got to run for president every 4 years and so forth. But their lives were miserable. I mean, they were registering every time they turned around. They smuggled out their treasurer, a very nice little man with a little Adolphe Menjou mustache, to Moscow, treasurer of the American Communist Party in the early 80s, to give him the Order of Lenin from Brezhnev, and he got it, and he came back, and then 2 or 3 years later, President Reagan gave him the Presidential Freedom Award because he had been an FBI asset for 30 or 40 years running the finances of the American Communist Party. We did lots of stuff, and I would say by the 70s or 80s, some of the early triumphs of the Communist Party in the U.S. during the war and getting some hiss and some of the assets into very important places like they did, those were largely gone, and they were a nuisance. It is very hard under current laws and policies to figure out how you would deal with Islamist totalitarians the same way. It is just a very difficult situation, and it's in part because of the sort of things Steve's talking about. It's in part because of the close relationship, at least at its roots, to some aspects of Islam. The long pole in the tent in having a nuclear weapon is the fissile material. It's not the design of the weapon. And so if you are under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and you have a reactor, you not only have a right, the system encourages you to get into the fuel cycle and enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And once you're enriching uranium, once you have enriched it up to a level of 3% U-235, which is what you need for fuel for a reactor, you're about 2/3 of the way in terms of work done to having 90% enriched that you need for a weapon. And if you are enriching up to 20% for medical purposes, you're about 85% of the way toward doing the work that's necessary to have 90% enriched for a weapon. If you do this with highly enriched uranium, all you're really doing is doing more of what you're doing to enrich it up to 3%. And so any kind, as the North Koreans and the Iranians have shown us and are showing us, and the Pakistanis earlier and so forth, it's very difficult to run something in such a way that you can say, at this point, they decided to have a nuclear weapon. They can go very far along the road, withdraw from the NPT, and put a weapon together, particularly if it's an HEU, so-called shotgun device, a very simple design. The one we used on Hiroshima, by the way, without one ever having been tested in the history of the world. What we tested at Alamogordo was a plutonium device, a more complicated device. It compresses the plutonium. That we tested at Alamogordo before we used it over Nagasaki. But the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima had never been tested in the history of the world. It was so simple. But it's one of the reasons for what I think is the single most deceptive national intelligence estimate I've ever been familiar with. I started reading NIEs in 1968, and the one that came out in 2007, basically headline was, Iran has stopped working on a nuclear weapon. Well, that should have been the footnote, because if they did stop with a design, and start it up again and finish it relatively quickly, what was important was in the footnote, and should have been the headline, which was, Iran continues its enrichment of uranium. It is really it's a very difficult circumstance to say that you can tell the point at which a country decides to have a nuclear weapon. If they're enriching uranium, and especially if they're doing it in some place like Fordo, north of Qum, that's high in the mountains and so forth, as the Iranians are, and you're doing it deep in a cave, at what point have you decided to have a weapon? When you are at 19% enriched heading toward 20, or do you have to get to 21? Who knows? The Japanese spokesman for the Japanese government on this issue, I don't think his name has ever been out for good reason. He was asked shortly after the North Koreans tested their nuclear weapon, sort of. It wasn't a very successful test, but they did have something go boom and have radioactivity and a mushroom cloud. He was asked if Japan now was thinking seriously of developing a nuclear weapon. And he said, no, absolutely not. We're under the Mutual Security Treaty with the Americans. We are the beneficiaries of the American nuclear umbrella. We wouldn't consider doing that. We wouldn't change our national policy. And then he paused and said, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's like this. He said, but if we decided to, it would take us 111 days. Okay? So anything that suggests there is a clear point that's knowable when somebody that is enriching uranium and enriching it inside a mountain and has centrifuges and already has several bombs worth of light enriched uranium and just needs to take it to more heavily enriched, at what point have they decided to have a nuclear weapon? There may be some bureaucratic memo that gets signed, but would we know? I don't see how. So when the Israelis talk about there being a sort of a choice point or a decision point that may be passed or about to be passed, I would say they know what they're talking about. If the Palestinian-Hamas relationship was as it was a year or two ago, then although I think it's a very, very thin masking, one could at least, I think, with at least, let's say, some officials at the Department of State could, with a straight face, make the argument that the Palestinian Authority was different than Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority might have some kind of status with UNESCO, and we could get along with that. I don't think I'd like that, but that's, one could at least say that with a straight face. Once the merger with Hamas starts to take place, you got a terrorist organization. You got to read its charter. It's the Jews and the Lions clubs and the Kiwanis and the Rotary clubs are all joined together to take over the world, and you have to kill them. I mean, that's basically what Hamas's charter says. That's a terrorist organization. So once the Palestinian Authority is merged with Hamas, if the United States doesn't want to fund and back terrorism, it seems to me to be very straightforward that you don't support institutions that are basically allowing, as members or near members, an institution like that merged Hamas Palestinian Authority entity. Most Americans are kind of vague about this. My own Presbyterian church has some folks in its national office that cause all kinds of difficulties along this line every 3 or 4 years. And a couple of years ago, they came out with their typical boycott Israel, et cetera, and they gave several of us a total of 3 minutes to rebut what they had said. And the group asked me if I would do it, and so I just got a copy of Hamas's charter and read it to them. And these are largely just perfectly normal folks who kind of, in our Presbyterian fashion, sit in the back pew and mumble and aren't very demonstrative about anything. And they didn't know that this national organization that was backing the idea that the Jews and the Rotarians were about to take over the world and had to be killed. And they voted 97% against it. So when ordinary, reasonable people have Hamas's ideas in front of them, they say, well, we can't do anything. That's crazy. But somehow it becomes possible, I guess, when you're in the State Department or some parts of the administration or something, to just kind of say, well, I guess Hamas is maybe no worse than a bad cold. Let's go ahead and make nice with them. I think that's crazy. I mean, if they've got 19 of our people, they're going to try. I'd echo Moses, say, let my people go. I mean, if you're going to if they're going to behave that way, of course they don't get the 1.5 billion, and I think a lot of other things need to be changed about dealing with them as well. We can't look. Crane Brinton's Anatomy of a Revolution, written back in the late 1930s, is still, I think, the best thing on this. Revolutions tend to have 3 phases. There's Act 1, in which everybody's enthusiastic and often in the streets, and it's often the young people, and a bright new tomorrow, and it's just a great idea. And everybody is in favor of it because what came before was autocratic or dictatorial or terrible, and here we go. And Act 2 often is a continuation of that. In the Russian Revolution, it was the Mensheviks. In Tehran, it was early 1979. In France, it was the tennis court oath people. It's the liberals, the reformers, the folks who say, look, the kids just overthrew, they stormed the Bastille, they overthrew the really bad guys. Now we can get in and have a constitution and freedom of speech and all that. Yeah, and that's the way Act 2 often reads in revolutions. And then there's Act 3. Act 3 is the Bolsheviks. Act 3 is Khomeini. Act 3 is Robespierre. Often doesn't turn out real well. We were very lucky. We had nobody in the entire American structure of the revolution kill one another except Alexander Hamilton got killed in a duel. Other than that, we weren't at one another's throats. Everybody worked it out. But that's often not the case. Now, it's not that it's hopeless. The world's gone from about 20 free states, democracies with civil liberties in 1945 to something between around 110 today, Freedom House numbers. That ain't bad. It's come about in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes it's been revolution. Sometimes it's been the communists being overthrown. In Mongolia, turned out to be pretty easy. Mongolian tribal councils are very consistent with democracy, and the Mongolians said, sure, fine. They just implemented democracy, worked fine. Ghana, it's working pretty well. It works differently in different circumstances. But once folks are in the streets, that Act 3 sometimes doesn't go well. And that is, I think, the heart of our problem. We can't just sign on to Acts 1 and 2 of the revolutions. We got to figure out if there's some way we can help the good guys avoid what often happens in Act 3.